So now I'm going to move on to talk about the test information and the 6 tests that I decided would be the most appropriate to carry out for my participant's sport and also his fitness levels. So the first component of fitness I decided to pick was the participant's speed, and the most appropriate test was the 30-minute sprint test. This involved the participant performing a adequate 10-minute warm-up before starting the fitness test, so a series of warm-up exercises, stretching exercises to get them ready and warm to complete the fitness testing session without injury. There would be 2 cones with a 30-metre distance between them. The participant would be required to start at the start cone and sprint as fast as they can to the finishing cone in their fastest time, which will be recorded with a stopwatch. So the equipment I needed was cones and a stopwatch and also adequate space. The next component of fitness was agility, and I decided to use the T-test. This test required a series of 4 cones set out in a T formation. The participant had to sprint from the starting cone A to B, touch it with their right hand, sidestep to cone C, touch it with their left hand, sidestep all the way back to cone D, touch it with their right hand, back to cone B, touch it with their left hand, and sprint as fast as they could back to cone A in the fastest time, which was recorded with a stopwatch. So I needed cones for the course and a stopwatch and adequate space in an outside environment. The next component of fitness was aerobic capacity, and I decided to use the 12-minute Cooper's run test. I made sure that the client completed the 12-minute Cooper's run test. It was marked out with 4 cones at 200-metre intervals around a course. And this fitness test requires them to continuously run for 12 minutes. And they would be keeping account of the number of metres that they run. Every time they passed a cone, it was 200 metres. I would also be keeping a score as well. And at the end, their score would be recorded down and compared to normative data. So the equipment required was stopwatch, cones, markers, and an adequate outdoor space. The next component of fitness was power, and I decided to use the standing vertical jump to test this. This involved the participant performing a counter movement by swinging their arms behind them and bending their knees to generate the power to form a sitting position, to then extend their legs and jump the highest distance that they could, and they would leave a mark on the wall with a pen. This would be repeated 3 times, and I would each time measure with a tape, measure the distance that they jumped, so the height they achieved, and their best score will be recorded down. So the equipment needed was a tape measure, a pen, and that was what was needed for that test. The next test was component of fitness was muscular strength, and I decided the wall squat test was the most appropriate. This involved the participant sitting in a chair-like position against a wall for the longest duration that they could possibly sustain, and obviously when they could no longer hold the position, the stopwatch would stop, and the stopwatch would only start when the participant was in the correct position, and that time that they sustain the position for will be recorded down. So the requirements for this test was a flat non-slip floor with a wall that was smooth and a stopwatch to record the total time. The last component of fitness I chose to measure was muscular endurance, and I used the sit-up test. This test involved the client performing as many sit-ups as they could with the correct form, which meant they had their hands behind their head and they had to go back fully to the ground. So any sit-ups that didn't have the correct form wouldn't be counted in the test. And they had to try and do as many as they could in 60 seconds. So the number of sit-ups that I counted that they performed with the correct form at the end were recorded down. So for this test I needed a flat non-slip floor and a stopwatch to administer the test correctly, and I decided to pick these tests because they were the most relevant to the sport, and he wanted to be a footballer, so these are very important skills that a footballer needs to have when they're on the pitch: speed, agility, aerobic capacity, power, muscular strength and muscular endurance, which we are going to go into a bit more detail when we do the evaluation. So now I'm going to move on to the test justification and the reasons why I chose these certain tests to to test these components of fitness. So firstly, we have the component fitness of speed, and I use the test of the 30-minute sprint test. In terms of this, the reason why I chose this component of fitness, because in football, speed is very important for a player, and they need to be able to sprint for interceptions, to sprint back with the loss of possession, and also a gain of possession, to sprint to goal, potentially to score a goal and to stop goals from them conceding goals. So it's really, really important for assisting as well as shooting. The reason why, in terms of this test, was suitable, it wasn't the most suitable test for my client, because there obviously are more gold standard tests that can be used to measure speed. However, in the current situation with the coronavirus pandemic, it was the most appropriate test to carry out still meticulously and scientifically. I could still measure the participant's speed using a suitable device that would give me quite accurate results. And in terms of the space as well, I didn't have much space, so the 30-metre test was quite suitable for the environment that I had to use. In terms of reliability, the test can be reliable. It's shown to have high reliability, but with that it can be subject to human error and bias due to using a stopwatch, so it can be subject to our human reaction times. So if I was to do this test again, or if I was to choose another test, I'd probably still choose the 30-minute sprint test, but I would use timing gates instead of a stopwatch. It's more reliable, it's computer generated, so then it eliminates the risk of subjective bias. Another factor that compromises the reliability is the environmental factors which can affect the overall results of the test. Factors like the surface that you choose to administer the sprint on means there was extraneous variables, like, for example, weather conditions, and as I had to conduct the 30-minute sprint test in the road, it wasn't necessarily the most appropriate surface, whereas if I had access to a running track, it probably would have been more reliable to conduct the test there. This test has high practicality. It means I can administer the test on a large sample at a time. It can be compared to normative data, and it doesn't require much space, so that means it's highly practical, and it can be adapted to use minimal equipment, so that's also a factor which makes it high practicality. It also has, to add on to reliability, high into research reliability, which means it can be compared with normative data, which is a good thing for this test. And even though it's a maximal activity, you do have to have motivation, but because it's quite a quick activity, and even though it's being repeated, it doesn't require as much motivation as some of the other tests, so that was quite a good thing. However, in terms of the validity, this test is an indirect test due to human error, because obviously it's subject to bias, and although it gives an overall opinion on a person's speed, it can correlate with the gold standard tests. It isn't the most accurate test to use, but it has high ecological validity because it can be applied and generalized to different environments and can be adapted to suit the client and the test environment. So that's why I chose that test. In terms of agility, and the reason why I picked the t-test, this test was very suitable. It was still difficult to administer and to make sure that it was being meticulously carried out in a scientific and standardised way, because obviously due to limited equipment and space, normally I would obviously use a tape measure to measure the distance between the cones to make sure it was exactly 10 metres and 5 metres, but I had to use paces to work that out, so that was probably compromised the overall reliability of the test. And it was suitable in the time, and due to the equipment that I had and the current situation, that's the test I chose to use. That would still give me a representation of my participant's agility that I could use to then set him targets in the evaluation. In terms of the practicality of the test, if I was in college and I obviously not with the current circumstances, I probably would have used the Illinois test, as that's got higher inter-research reliability than the t-test. But as I mentioned before, due to limited space, equipment and current restrictions, the t-test was more suitable. I didn't have the equipment to set out the Illinois test and the space. However, the t-test can be very highly reliable, and this is because it measures a combination of components. So it measures leg speed, leg power and agility, and this can help to differentiate between low and high levels of sport participation. So this shows that it's got good reliability. It also has high inter-rater reliability, which has been carried out by lots of different people to produce similar results, which is good. And it just gives a representation of overall agility. It also has high validity. Has high ecological validity as well. It can be applied to many different environments, as that shows how I was able to sort of adapt it to still make it scientific and a valid test. And it's direct. It's measuring a combination of components, not just, for example, leg speed and leg power. So this test was actually a quite reliable and suitable test to use. I decided to measure agility because agility is very important in sport to cope with especially in football, to cope with the changes in direction, changes in pace and speed when obviously the demands of the game change, and obviously you're required, for example, to maybe sprint back into position or sprint for a goal or jog back, to cope with those different intensities, which is why it was important. So this test overall was a good test to use to measure the participants' agility. In terms of aerobic capacity, I chose the 12-minute Cooper's run. In terms of justification for this, the 12-minute Cooper's run has high reliability. Studies have shown a correlation coefficient of 0.9 between distance covered and VO2 max, which is really, really good. It shows high inter-researcher reliability, as anything over 0.8 is considered to have a high correlation and between distance covered and VO2 max, which is good. So we can actually predict their VO2 max levels just from the distance that they cover. However, this test also can have low reliability. It can be influenced by extraneous variables. For example, this can depend on the individual's fitness levels and abilities. So, for example, my client didn't run long distance quite a lot compared to some other people who conduct the test. Perhaps could run quite regularly, so they have a better level of practice. However, it can also be affected by environmental factors like temperature and the surface that you use, and the weather conditions and the surface that you conduct the test on. So that can compromise the reliability, but also the standardization of the test. If it's not being conducted in the same type of environment every time, this can compromise the reliability. So as my test was conducted on the pavement around my local town, it's not the most reliable way of conducting the test, as I would have preferred to have done it on a running track or in an indoor space where I could control the extraneous variables. But I had to use the spaces and equipment that was available to me to administer the test as well as I could. In terms of validity, this test has low validity because it's not just VO2 max that contributes to running performance. There are a variety of other factors that can affect your running performance. For example, your body structure, gender can play a role, your height, your weight. There are lots of different factors that can ultimately affect your running performance. So this is not a direct test, so it will be less accurate, as for some people it will overestimate their VO2 max and some people it will underestimate, so therefore it's not producing the most accurate results. Whereas if you were to use a gold standard test, which would directly measure these factors and eliminate extraneous variables.